on the board and happy to work at whatever pace and whatever needs are required by the committee.
Excellent. Laura, do you think we can call the roll?
Perfect.
I think we can, yeah. And so just a reminder, everyone say where they're calling in from, city and state. So Johanna Slanga.
Hi, everybody. This is Johanna Slenga. I am in Bloomfield, Michigan, and I am the chair of the Birmingham Multi-Modal Transportation Board. I've had various roles in different capacities across traffic and safety, and then joined this board as part of I would say a non-resident member, and have been on it for, I don't know, I think at least 5 years or so now, 4 years maybe.
Since the beginning, I believe.
Yeah, I guess it was because it was traffic and safety, and then it became, so been in and out of this environment for about 8 years. So some of that's been specific to multimodal, but anyway, welcome to the new members, and yeah, let's keep going through the roll call. Laura, thanks.
David Hopper. You're muted.
From Birmingham, Michigan. I've spent a majority of my career in real estate development and facilities management. Most recently, I managed a portfolio of 320 industrial and commercial properties across the globe, and have lived in various parts of the world as well, and get a certain feel for how people do things and how people shouldn't do things from a multimodal perspective. So hopefully I can impart some of that to some use on the committee.
David.
Yes. I'm calling from Birmingham, Michigan. I've lived in Birmingham other than college, and 2 years after college, I've lived in Birmingham since 1960, and I'm an avid walker, biker, and pretty much know every street in the city, and I am gainfully retired.
Andrew Haig.
Hello, Andrew Haig, Birmingham, Michigan. I've lived and worked in 4 or 5 different countries over the years. Been here in Birmingham for 11 years, something like that. Finance, engineering, financial engineering, operations is a lot of the background. Don't know what else to say.
Okay, Tom Peard.
Hi, my name's Tom Peard. I'm calling you from Birmingham, Michigan. Oh, start my video. I'm calling you from Birmingham, Michigan. I've been on the board for less than a year. I think I joined in February or thereabouts. I know it was cold out. My background engineer in the automotive industry. I work for a company called Denso down in Southfield. We supply all the major OEMs. And I just want to say welcome to the new guys. It's good to have you here, and it's been good fun so far, so I think you'll enjoy it.
Katie Schaefer. Okay, Doug White.
Doug White here from Birmingham, Michigan. Been on the board, I think, close to 3 years now. I've lived in Birmingham, I think about 12 years or so. Was in the automotive business for 30 plus years. So look forward to working with the new guys.
And Josie, who I believe is not here. So that concludes the roll call.
And Laura, Katie did join us.
Oh, great. Okay, Katie, can you tell us where you're calling in from and give a brief introduction, because there are 2 new members of the board?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Katie Schaefer. I am a resident of Birmingham. Obviously, I live on Fairway. I am also a pediatrician in the community. I have been on this board for, I think, almost 3 years. My term may be coming up in March of next year. I also recently sat on the ad hoc unimproved streets committee, which was supposed to be an 11-month term that turned into 2.5 years. So that final draft is being presented at the December 21st meeting. So sorry, I'm late. I was talking to my nurses and then looked at my watch and realized I was late. So I'm so sorry.
And can you tell us where you're dialing in from? What city
I'm
and state?
Birmingham, Michigan.
Great, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, and then just maybe for the benefit of the new members, my name is Jana Ecker. I'm the planning director for the city of Birmingham. Scott?
Hi, I'm Scott Gruey. I am the operations commander for the police department.
Jim?
I'm Jim Surhai. I'm in the engineering department as a consulting city engineer.
Julie?
Hi, I'm Julie Kroll. I work for Fleece of Edinburgh. I am the traffic engineering consultant for the city of Birmingham.
Eric?
And I'm Eric Brunk. I'm the IT manager for the city and help to facilitate most of these meetings.
And Laura?
I do the minutes of these meetings and I take the roll call.
Okay, well, welcome.
Yeah, welcome everybody. So I'm just trying to, apologize, I'm flipping back and forth between the agenda and the Zoom screen. So hopefully you've had a chance to review the agenda prior to today. And the first order of business is to approve the minutes from November the 5th. Just for those of you that are new, we do require a motion to approve the minutes, a second, and then we will go through the roll call.
A motion to approve?
Thank you, Doug. Second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Sorry, I see Julie's hand. I'm sorry. We have a vote going. Julie, do we need to pause or can I?
I noted an error on the meeting minute.
Okay.
Underneath attendees for Fleece and Vandenbrink, it listed Justin Rose, and he was not in attendance.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second with the noted attendee correction.
And who was the second? Sorry.
Tom.
Thank you.
Laura, can you read the roll, please?
Yep. Doug White,
Aye.
Tom Peard,
Aye.
Katie Schaefer,
Aye.
Johanna Slanga,
Yes.
David Lurie.
I will pass.
Perfect.
I wasn't at the meeting.
David Hawker,
Pass. Wasn't at
Andrew
the,
Reed.
Yes.
And I think that's it. Did I miss anyone?
I don't think you've missed anyone, Laura. There is a member or someone on a Galaxy S9 Plus. Before we continue, can we, Laura, do you know who that is?
That's Brad Streeter.
Oh, hi, Brad.
Brad. Okay, well. All right, great. So, yeah. So we have some new members. Brad, why don't you, well, before we get jumping into the first topic, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Brad Streeter, transportation planner with MKSK, one of the consultants that advises the board and the city on transportation items.
Perfect. Okay. So the first and only item on the agenda today is the update on ADA parking. I'm not sure who's taking us through that, but if you could jump in.
That would be Commander Gruey.
Well, good evening, everybody. The city wanted to update the board on some recent developments with the ADA as far as parking and curb ramps and basically just overall accessibility. Back in 2019, early 2019, the city was actually contacted by an attorney representing an individual who required use of some of the ADA parking as well as some ramps and expressed some concerns over the accessibility and whether or not they were up to spec in certain areas. That did eventually result in a consent decree judgment being entered into an agreement with the city and this attorney, which basically gave the city 5 years to go through and correct some of these issues. With that being said, I just want to make sure everybody is aware that when all the streets were designed and built, they would have been built to whatever spec or standard was appropriate at that time. Some of the streets are fairly old and some of those requirements for the ADA has obviously changed over the years. and some of those ramps and or parking locations weren't up to the requirements per the ADA. So that's kind of what prompted all this. Anyways, going forward, the police department started reviewing all the ADA parking spaces that we have on street. There's currently 79 ADA spaces on street, and there's 86 ADA spaces within the structures. The first thing we did was look at all those ADA spaces to determine whether or not they met the accessibility requirements. And if they did, was it even possible for us to make them more accessible? For instance, the relation of that ADA parking spot to a curb ramp, to a crosswalk, or accessibility to meters, anything that would have been in the way to, I guess, make that accessibility a problem. We had some meters that were in tree wells, for instance, that necessarily wouldn't have violated ADA policy, but definitely not the easiest thing for someone to traverse if they had some difficulties walking or some mobility challenges. So we went through those 79 spaces and reviewed those. Of the 79 spaces, there was 51 that needed some form of change. That may have been a curb ramp that needed to get installed next to that to give it access to a sidewalk, or it could have been a parking meter location. But in all, there was 51 of those spaces that needed to be changed. In the structures, there was 37 locations that were not compliant that needed to be changed. So what I want to do is just review what some of those changes are and what some of the things that the city's working on. I'm going to share my screen here with you. Does everybody see the PowerPoint here with the ADA updates?
Yep.
Okay. What I want to do is just kind of go through what some of these changes were, what things we found, and what we're doing to correct those. And if anybody has a question, just please speak up. And why I got this on the screen, unfortunately, I don't see you guys, so I don't see you raising a hand or anything. But go ahead and feel free to just speak up. I won't be bothered about it. So this is what I wanted to start off with, is showing you what a current ADA spot looks like on Old Woodward, where we just redid the street, to see what we did here and why this is compliant and what goals we're trying to reach. So every ADA parking spot has to have an accessible area, which is this area to the right here in blue that's hashed out. A lot of our existing ADA spaces did not have that. That was one of the main things we found that we had to add. Additionally, they have to have access to a sidewalk with a curb ramp here. So you can see here, we got plenty of room for accessibility, whether this be a van spot, van accessibility or not. There's more than enough room here, and our curb ramp right here gives easy access to the meter, which is in front of the spot. It's all paved, it's all level, it all meets the slope requirements required per the ADA specs.
Hey, Scott, real quick, can you, as you're going through these, can you describe, or maybe if you're aware of exactly how a person might use these spots, if it's like a side door ramp, or in some ways I think they use rear access to vehicles. Like, just that might help with a little bit of the human aspect of what these specific areas are designed for, if you're aware of them.
Sure. Yep. And we can talk about that too as we go through some of the other locations. So on a parallel spot like this, one of the things we look at is if most of your accessible vans that have ramps for wheelchair bound individuals, most of those primarily come out the passenger side. So when we looked at these spots, that's why you're going to see most of these accessible areas are on the passenger side. However, the ADA just requires it has an accessible area. It doesn't necessarily require what side it is on. However, because we know that, most of them we tried to put on the passenger side to give that access. So that would be demonstrated here. But to show you some other areas just to move forward, this is a spot that we have several that are like this. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. But we'll go over a little bit more of the rear access vans and some things we did for that. But in this location, one of the things we found in several areas throughout the city is that we have an ADA spot that's indicated here in the blue markings. However, the meter, if you can imagine having some type of mobility challenges, to get to that meter, one would have to first traverse the travel lane, use the crosswalk, the ramp that's up there, and then come back down the sidewalk, go over the grass around a tree here to get to that meter. So what we looked at doing in these locations is we are adding a ramp to the rear of this space here so that the person can get up to the sidewalk, as well as we're putting in a cement pad next to this parking space so that the person will be able to come out of the vehicle on the passenger side. If it is a passenger side entry for a wheelchair bound person, you'd be able to put that ramp right down to the sidewalk and exit the vehicle, as well as get direct access to the meter on a cement pad. So once that cement pad gets installed, that meter post will get moved to within that pad to give easier access to it. This is an example of one where we had where the meter was in the tree well, that we moved all those to make that easier to get to. This is an example of an existing ADA spot that didn't meet the compliance. Number one, it did not have a access area marked out. What we've done in this area is we've used this yellow curb area and have created an access area there, given that we had the space. And we'll also be putting in a curb ramp here so that can you guys see, I'm saying here, but can you guys see my cursor on the screen?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yes.
I just realized I wasn't sure if you saw it or not. We'll be installing curb ramps at these locations so that an individual coming out of this vehicle does not have to go into the roadway and access the ramps that exist through crosswalks. There'll be a separate ramp for that ADA space, much like we saw on the new design that's on Old Woodward. So those will get added as we do that. And again, that's a 5-year plan to do that. This is another example where we have a meter that's in a grass area. The difference and the reason I added this picture here is to show that we're actually moving this spot to a complete different location because the elevation change between the roadway and the sidewalk here, there is no way to make this spot compliant. Even if we were to add a ramp in here or try to put a cement pad in here, the slope is too great. So this spot has to move completely. The other thing to look at while we're looking at a parallel spot is what we did on some of these parallel spots. This X area that we have between spots, we have used that to create an access area. Again, this would be in other locations where we don't deal with the slope issue here from the sidewalk to the street. But as an example, we're using this white X area, painting that blue to become an access area, and ramps are being installed at the rear of these parking spots. So those rear access vans, those rear ramp vans will be able to drop the ramp off the back and they'll be able to access the sidewalk right from a separate ramp that's installed at that location. This is a spot on Old Woodward. This is down by the grass triangle there just south of Haynes. Again, here we had a situation where meters are in the grass. There's no access to the sidewalk. People are having to traverse the roadway to the crosswalk to then come back. What we've done here in this location is we've moved this southern spot, one spot to the south, and this entire area right here is becoming the access area, and a ramp is being installed between the roadway and the sidewalk. This is an area where the sidewalk is slightly higher than the road, and the sidewalk is actually being lowered where the ramp is to meet the slope requirements per the ADA policies. This is just another example of the one I showed before where we're using this yellow curb area to create an access area here, and then we'll be installing a ramp. And our Department of Public Services is moving this bike lock area to a different space to be out of the way for the ramp. Any questions on parking spaces? So this year, the city, we targeted the area around Shane Park to start making some of these changes. With COVID-19 and all the city special events and that being canceled, we determined it was a good time to do the area around Shane Park when the pedestrian traffic was a lot lower than what we would typically see during the summertime. So if you've driven around Shane Park, around City Hall, all those ramps in that area have been updated and those parking spaces have been updated to meet these new standards.
So then to accommodate for a rear access van, the driver would actually have to search for the appropriate spot because we don't have a, say, a one size fits all.
So that's somewhat correct. We do not have a one size fits all. The spots are all slightly different depending on the location, whether it's an angled space or a parallel space. However, we do have a requirement that vehicles do not back into parking spaces. That does not exist for the ADA spaces. We will not, that's not a violation for them. So there are spaces, for instance, where there is no access area on the passenger side of the vehicle. It's actually on the driver's side of the vehicle. And in that area, if someone was to back into that spot, it then makes the access area on the passenger side. So we do allow for that. As far as a rear access van, that's correct. I mean, the only area where they're going to have a rear access area where that would work is in a parallel parking location, simply because of where the roadway exists in relation to an angled parking spot. It doesn't mean they can't use it. I just wouldn't suggest it, as they'll be exiting the vehicle into the roadway.
Go ahead,
I mean,
Tom.
just looking at this one spot, if you rotated the parking spot 45 degrees and instead having a parallel parking arrangement, you know, I don't know from the ADA regs whether they have any type of a stencil that allows you to accommodate both. So given the, you know, the configuration of the spot, you could accommodate a rear access by hugging the curb with your vehicle, or you just pull in to the spot as designed with a side access.
So that is true. However, one of the things that we do face and have to deal with is the state law requirement as far as how close a vehicle can park to an intersection. Most of these yellow curbs are going to be that distance, or going to be a sightline issue distance. State law, you can't park within 15 feet of an intersection. Most of those yellow curbs are going to be that 15 feet. There is an area, we did exactly what you're talking about, however, though. In front of the 411 building, there's a ADA space there that was an angled parking space. Being that there is no intersection right there, we did turn that space parallel just so it does have that additional access area. So where we could, we did do that. Unfortunately, in this area, it just brings that car closer to the intersection, violating where that yellow curb needs to extend to.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Tom. I think you were up next. I see you,
Yeah.
Andrew.
First of all, good material. Thank you, Scott. The first page, I think it's the first one, you showed the zone and the new construction area. Just curious, you mentioned that the amount of space you need to be compliant with the ADA to the right of the vehicle in this case. How much space do you need?
So there's a couple different scenarios, and it's a minimum of 5 feet, from my understanding correctly. And your ADA, Julie may be able to help us out with that, but when we looked at this, it's a minimum of 5 feet depending on the width of the space. So it's more of like it can be a combination of both, and it can be also a shared accessible between two spaces. So ideally, we look for 8 feet. If we can get 8 feet, that means it's more accessible for a van use or ramp use. That's what we try to accomplish in most areas. Some of the areas around City Hall, for instance, where the road was just recently reconstructed and there wasn't a lot of room, we put a 5-foot access area because that's all that was required in those spaces. And Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that that's the standard, is the 5 feet, 8 feet for van accessible. But even the 8 feet can be 5 feet if the parking space itself is wider, and then it's an overall width between the parking space and the accessible area.
That I don't know off the top of my head. Brad, maybe you know the ADA widths off the top of your head? Or Jim?
It was definitely all reviewed before we did this, and
Top
in the head, I don't remember those exactly.
Yeah, I could speak to that a little bit. Yeah, I think, you know, Scott's right. There is a multiple applications, and again, the purpose of ADA guidelines is to improve access and not, you know, for understanding there's variable conditions. So I think like that 8 feet, you could have van accessible, it's 8 feet wide, but you could also have your parking space is only 8 feet wide. You could have 8 and 8, or you could have a 10-foot wide parking space plus a 6-foot wide accessible space, and that occupies the same space in your parking area. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Andrew, go ahead. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Nice job, nice work. I was just curious, just having read through specs in my daily life, sometimes they're a little difficult to really interpret in reality. They get a bit abstract. I was wondering if we've actually had anybody who has a disability van and a wheelchair try out a couple of them just to give empirical feedback, specific feedback on what it felt like. See if it felt better, because it was obviously driven by someone with a disability. I was curious if we actually have a way of trying to check it, see if we got it right.
So the lady that was part of the initial lawsuit with the city, in speaking with her, we did basically a tour around most of the downtown, reviewing a lot of these different areas. And specifically the spot that I have on the page now, when we looked at the new Old Woodward spots, she was very happy with the accessibility, the amount of the space that she had to use it, as well as the separate individual ramp that was installed for their use to access the sidewalk. So she's just one example. We did have another consultant that came in and worked with us who works with people who are mobility challenged. He brought in a group of his students, we'll say. He works with them to help them traverse everyday life, and mobility was a big part of that. So he did bring his group in and took a walk around the city to provide us feedback before we started any reconstruction, but during this whole process, even before the consent decree was reached, to give us some feedback on things that the city has done or things the city should look at to improve on. And basically they said the same thing, that looking at anything that was a recent design, along this stretch of Old Woodward, that it was very easy for them to access it. It was open, inviting. They actually thought some of the conditions that the attorney and the other person were complaining about were just fine. However, that we are replacing some of those because of the ADA compliance. But it was a good group, peer group that came in and was able to just kind of walk around and give us some feedback. So we have done some of that, yes.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Commander.
Okay, to continue on beyond just the parking spots, part of the consent decree was all the ramps, the curb ramps accessing the sidewalks, whether it be from an ADA parking spot itself or just a regular curb ramp where a crosswalk crosses the street, and whether or not those ramps themselves are compliant. So this is just a graph of what we used as we went around and to measure all these different curb ramps. And if you look at what is at the top there, where you see the measurements that would be 1 through 6, the box there is defined by A and B. That's what they would call their level landing pad. Every ramp has to have a level landing pad to which you can then travel in any direction from there. So the distance to that level landing pad from the curb could be a variety of different distances. However, there has to be a pad at the top, again, called a level landing pad, that has no more than a 2% grade in any one direction. The idea there is that any person can come up to this spot and then travel in any direction from a level area where they're not, if they're in a wheelchair, they're not sloping to one direction or another, so that they can traverse in any direction. So the first requirement is we went through is found and to try to determine each one of these locations what should be the level landing pad, and then measured to find out whether or not it met the 2% slope requirement. And then we measured the ramp itself. So in the ramp itself, if you look at measurements, which would be 7, 8, 9, 13, and 14, that's considered your cross slope. A cross slope couldn't have any more than a 2% cross slope. And then your rise in your slope, which would be the 10, 11, 12, and 15, your rise from the curb to the level landing pad couldn't be greater than 8%. So as we went through, we identified an area that we were going to work on. That was the area, again, I told you, like around Shane Park. We went through and measured every single curb ramp and documented those different slopes and grades for those ramps in that area. The ones that we identified, we then had our engineering consultants look at them to redesign those ramps to make them compliant. Here are some examples of things that we found that were a problem. So in this area here, you can see that there really is, number one, there's no level landing pad in the middle here. This would be what should be considered your level landing pad, so you can go in either direction. However, if you're coming in this direction here, you'd have to turn and go up this ramp before you ever got to that level landing pad. But the major problem here was this cross slope. You can tell just by looking at the picture here that there's quite a cross slope here. So as someone's traversing this ramp to come up to what should be a level landing pad, it would never meet the ADA requirements because of the cross slope there. So this was something that was identified and redesigned and rebuilt. This is a similar situation here where regardless of which direction you're coming from, if you're coming here and or coming here, the cross slope in either direction is much further than 2%. And then again, because of that, there's no level landing pad here for someone to come in either one direction and change direction to travel wherever they were heading to. That's another location that had to be redesigned. So this kind of shows a couple different things here. We'll go over this one. So the problem we had here, this is down Phoenicia Restaurant. This is the crosswalk from Old Woodward and Bowers there. And the problem we have here is this crosswalk ends halfway into the driveway of their parking lot. Again, there's no cross slope here that would be compliant, that would be less than 2%. So that was a main issue, as well as the rise in this slope because of the driveway was greater than 8%. The additional problem we have here was the ADA parking space here. Number one, first off, there was no accessible area marked here. And then the ramp they would have to use would be this same ramp here where this crosswalk is. That would be the nearest crosswalk, or nearest ramp. So what we did in this location actually is we moved this ADA space 2 spaces to the south. And this crosswalk, which is currently on the north side of that intersection, is going to be moved to the south side of the intersection so that there be a new ramp put in this location here. The new parking space will have an accessible area next to it and will utilize that same ramp. So now the crosswalk and the ADA parking space will both have a compliant accessible area and a ramp to access the sidewalk. Here's another example. This is right next to City Hall here, where when we measured this, the level landing pad here, just to show you, should be right here. As you come up this ramp is obviously a lot longer than this one would be, but this would be where your level landing pad should be, because this is where a person would change direction to travel either to the east or continue going south. So this area here had to be less than 2% slope in any direction, and this area here had to have less than an 8% rise in the grade and no more than a 2% slope as well. So that's basically a quick summary of how we looked at all these different ramps, how they were all measured, and how we identified ones that were not compliant and were reported to the engineering consultants to redesign those ramps.
Hey, Scott. So thanks for bringing this in. Appreciate it. Maynard, this is awesome. The last project we did, I think, was really focused around Maple. One is I don't know if I saw specific Maple effects, not necessarily even noted here, but maybe just verbal if you have any that you could refresh us of. And then 2, do we have any plans in work in process that we're actively adjusting as part of this learning that we have?
So regarding Maple, this was all taken into account when Maple was designed. Those spaces do have accessible areas behind them. There are separate ramps installed, much like we have on Old Woodward. If you've walked through the new Maple now, you'll see those spots are much more accessible than what was there in the past. Regarding going forward, MDOT is the one who puts out the ADA standards, and those are the standards that are being followed by the city when they design the roads. So Maple did follow the MDOT requirements, or the MDOT standards that they published for the ADA requirements. And any recent road project did follow those same standards.
I guess
and that's something that's as well before these roads are rebuilt. I mean, that's one thing that, if you recall, that this board did discuss when we looked at Maple, as far as where those spots were going to be and what the accessible area was going to be.
Yeah, one other quick expansion on my question. How far is this work gonna connect? Is this going to go into the neighborhood streets? How, you know, I know we don't have any specific maybe spot spaces, but what about landing pads and ramps and, you know, the more walkable, accessible part of the community?
So the current 5-year project that's part of the consent decree is the central business district only. It does extend north of Woodward up to Oak and south of Woodward down to Lincoln. So it's going to be that entire area. There is no current plan to go and retrofit any spaces or any places in the residential area. However, when those are rebuilt, much like Lakeside was just rebuilt, all those ramps are built to spec per MDOT's ADA requirements.
So that's it for my questions.
Does that answer your question?
That does answer my question. Yeah, I appreciate all the explanation and you bringing it in. I see Dave Lurie, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not going to use the right terminology, but my question is, what about the bumps that are on the ramps? I don't know if those are for sight challenged people. You know, they're metal plates now. They're sometimes cast in cement or concrete. Why are those put there? Is that an ADA requirement? Am I making any sense?
You are. Those are an ADA requirement. Yeah, I couldn't tell you as far as how far back those have been required, but those are part of the ADA requirement. So anytime we do even if it's just patchwork on a sidewalk, then it has to be brought up to current code. So if there's a place where there's not one now, it would be installed as new work is done. Any future ramps that are rebuilt or installed will have those domes.
Yeah, those domes are kind of called tactile strips usually, but yeah, I think it's been about 15 years now that they've been required. And it is for the sight impaired primarily, and to help guide them to where the crossings are. So even that, some that were originally installed, they used to direct people with vision impairments to the center of the intersection when they had big curved ones. And so the more modern way through the access board has been to have them directly lined up with crosswalks. So the ADA is always kind of refining things. So cities are always playing a little bit of catch up with the latest design standards. So we try to incorporate the latest approved practices when we're doing design work on the Maple Road project. For those of you involved in that, we looked at even some of the things the access board is looking at as best practices, but not required yet. And we looked at trying to apply those on the Maple, but it ended up removing too much on-street parking. So the decision was made upon the recommendation of this board to go with what's required now. But we have continued to look at sort of the best practices to be a little bit ahead of the game.
Mr. Harker, is you there?
Yes, just a question as it relates to private parking lots that exist within the CBD. How are those governed? Are they governed under the same ADA rules, and is there transparency in what we're doing to influence what they do?
So yes, they are governed under the same rules. They have to follow the ADA requirements as far as the number of ADA spaces based on the number of spaces that are available in that lot. As far as the city controlling some of that, when they go through their design review and planning for those new locations, that would be reviewed with the city to make sure they're compliant.
So I guess maybe this is a more technical question, but let's take, for instance, a drugstore that opens up, and they have a parking lot in the back, and there's street parking that's owned by the city. When they go through the municipal review, are they getting credits for if there are existing handicap spots that are governed under the city plan? Are they getting credits for those handicap spots when they build out their parking lot?
No, they're not. When they come through with a private development on private property, especially if they're not located in the parking assessment district. So let's assume it's a property such as either of the CVS's in town that are not in the downtown public parking zone. They do not get credit for it, and the square footage of the buildings, the size of the parking lot, and the uses dictate how many ADA compliant spots they need to provide on site. And they don't get credit for any of the public ones on street.
Okay, so if there are new regs that are released, how do the private owners know that they're out of compliance and they need to comply? Is it the city that needs to take action on that? Is it a county thing? How does that work?
So most of those compliance things, when it comes down to ADA or new specs, is they only come into effect anytime there is work done on that property. So if they were to redesign their parking lot or change their parking lot, they would have to come into compliance with the new requirements. If there was a new, something changed, let's say in the next 6 months, it doesn't mean that they all have to go back and retrofit it necessarily. It's typically whenever there's any work done on that lot or any patchwork done or replacement of pavement that they would have to then become compliant with the new standards.
Okay, so something, so in essence, they are grandfathered under the regs that were in existence at the time that the structure was built or the facility was built, and they remain grandfathered under that until somebody decides to change it. Is that a correct assessment?
So that's typically true. And I say that only because when I started, I mentioned that, all these ramps that we have that we're addressing now were built to compliance at the time. However, in our research, we found that some court rulings were saying, yeah, we understand that they were built to compliance and you haven't touched the road since, so they stand as they are. However, we think you need to bring them up to compliance, which is why the city entered into the consent decree to go forward and change all these ramps. So the courts have treated the city slightly different. I don't know if someone attempted to sue a private entity for their ADA accessibility, what the ruling would be there. But traditionally it is, unless it's touched, it is grandfathered.
Yeah, I think it's partly that the expectation is the municipality as a public entity has a greater obligation to meet the ADA, even when there's not a road reconstruction project going on. So these lawsuits have been sort of kind of picking and choosing communities. And, but so generally the private sector, private property is allowed to grandfather more generously than cities have been allowed to. But there are a lot of cities throughout Michigan and counties throughout Michigan that don't meet ADA either. And so they're being sort of advanced to upgrade to ADA because of these lawsuits. The whole process has often begun because that's the only way that the people with vision and hearing impairments, mobility impairments have found. They use this access board and groups to sue to start getting upgrades going on. And then as they kind of move through metropolitan areas to gradually get the public sector to upgrade to ADA, that doesn't mean at some point they might start looking for major companies or amusement parks have been, I think, sued when they weren't ADA compliant. So they've generally upgraded as well. So as Scott said, it's not always black and white, but generally the expectation is cities are supposed to upgrade at a more rapid process than private sector.
Yeah, just as one minor tidbit of thought here, that when we reviewed Old Woodward from whatever it was, like Willits to Brown, when we did that section, it hadn't, we discussed the time span it would take us to do something major to that street again. And if I remember right, the years were like 60 to 75 years. So the general acceptability of touching a street as the world advances and people have all sorts of challenges, it's a very long span to let something ride that long. And maybe, if we were doing pavement or things along that way, but generally it's a long span before things get some major reconstruction.
So one more question. ADA only governs existing built environments. Am I correct? So
No,
in
they-
other words, specifically, I'll refer to some areas as unimproved sidewalk areas. Meaning that we have sidewalks that drop off and don't continue to connect to other sidewalks. That does not come under ADA at all.
So it does if that was to get reconstructed, if that unimproved, for instance, if you're speaking of an unimproved street, if that street becomes an improved street, it would have to meet all those ADA requirements as well.
Well,
Those sidewalks that
I guess
currently-
I'm referring to certain areas, like for instance, the stretch of New Woodward from, what is that, Oak Street going south towards, is that Brown? Intersection on either side, either the east side or the west side, we have no sidewalk that connects north-south.
Are you talking south of the 555 building on its way towards like Lincoln? Or
Actually, it's
talking
north,
about-
I'm sorry, it's north of the 555 building. So between Oak Street, which would be where the mobile station is.
You're talking main Woodward, not old Woodward.
Correct, Main Woodward, sorry.
Main Woodward, got it.
Yep.
There is
There's no
I'm
sidewalk.
looking at Google Maps right now, just a picture. That's why I'm scrolling around, but there is a sidewalk. But yeah, it does actually stop at Oak. There's nothing at Oak until it goes up to Big Beaver. It's kind
Yeah,
of a weird.
nothing goes north and south on New Woodward, let's say north of, is that Brown? I can't remember what,
If this helps, ADA does not require sidewalks be installed. So we
okay,
have a lot of communities that don't have sidewalks, but if you install them, then they need to meet ADA standards.
But we are paying to contribute towards the crossing at Big Beaver for no sidewalk, though, right? I think that was one of the things that came up in the city commission meeting a couple of months ago, that we're sharing the cost of that with Bloomfield, and it's a crossing to nowhere. It's kind of what David's getting at. There's no sidewalk for its services.
And if I could just add as well,
For what David's asking, that would be new ADA because it's new construction. Sidewalk, crossing, ramps would have to all be the new compliance, right?
Correct.
and if I could add as well, Mr. Hocker, if you go to the multimodal transportation plan, there is a whole section on areas where the sidewalk system is not complete. So there are breaks, and Big Woodward is one of the major areas where we do have issues with connectivity. And so that is one of the goals for the city as a whole, is to put sidewalks in those locations where they're missing. Oftentimes we try when there's a new road project coming through, especially if the city owns it. And it can be challenging at times,
So since this is a sidewalk that would be on a county road, right?
State road.
State road, sorry. The state doesn't pay for the corresponding sidewalk.
The state doesn't necessarily deem a sidewalk necessary. What happens generally when they do major repairs, they'll come to the city that it's going through and they'll ask for some feedback and comments. They don't necessarily always follow them. Sometimes we will go to MDOT and say, look, we really need some crossing improvements at this location, or we really want to see a sidewalk. And of course, they'll generally tell us they're governed by their budget and whether they have enough money to do that at this time and so on. So it's always a negotiation dance.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, lots of good dialogue here. Really appreciate Commander Grube bringing this in, and I know it was one of our requests to further understand just what's going on in the community and how we can make it improved all the time. To this specific topic, is there any other questions for Commander Jana? Okay, I'm going to move on with the agenda. There's not much left here, at least on the official agenda. So I don't see anyone from the public, but for those of you that are on the board, are there any questions or comments to bring up before we move to close the meeting? The ones that are not on the agenda specifically. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, a couple of things. I'm just looking at the attachment in the agenda for this mobility, whatever it's called, MOD. It means something else to me, I'm afraid. And it specifically has 2 Birmingham points in it, Maple and 14, with all sorts of items brought up that go actually into the neighborhoods as far as planned microtransit zone, crosswalks, railroads, blah, blah, blah. It's interesting to read this. Where is this something that we would be bringing into some of our action? Because it's, as soon as you say microtransit zone, then that's our purview. And it's the area that's called out is inside the city. It's not a state area, not a county area, it's Birmingham City. So this is good to see this. It's very helpful to see this. But because it's combined with multiple cities down the entire Woodward corridor, what is our action item out of this? And if there isn't a specific action item because it's addressing items within Birmingham, where do we bring action items into this? Because it's obviously, like I said, it's inherent to multimodal. Maybe a related question to that, the Birmingham 2040 plan. There are parts of the 2040 plan that currently is only going through the planning board, but they're addressing things like changing West Lincoln, for instance. There's a proposal to change West Lincoln from the bike lane setup today to change the bike lane structure in there, remove some of the bump outs, you name it, to have a permanent bike lane as opposed to shared paths. Again, that's multimodal. How do those come into this board? Because you can't just have that entire plan go through planning. Thanks very much, have a nice day. Everybody else is ignored. Doesn't matter whether it's your board's purview or not. How do we address items like that? Because I see that as being linked also to this, because it's brought in from an outside source, but it's inside our scope. Maybe just an open question.
Go ahead, Jana.
Well, with regards to the master plan, and Andrew, this may have been before you were on the board. I can't recall how long you've been on, but we did send the first draft of the master plan around to all of the boards that it kind of touched on, and we reviewed all of the recommendations related to multimodal for this board, for instance, and the multimodal board provided comments and feedback, and we provided those back to the consultants. Now, we haven't come back with a second draft of the master plan yet, so they haven't been incorporated yet, but we did bring it to the board. So for instance, it went to the advisory parking board, it went to, for parking related concerns, it went to the Parks and Rec board for park recommendations, it went to the multimodal board, historic district commission, and so on, public arts board, etc. So we did kind of have at least an overview, review, and commentary, so that if there were any members on those boards that had issues related to areas within their purview, they could provide their comments and their feedback and their recommendations. With regards to this plan, it's done by the RTA, the Regional Transit Authority, so it is more of a regional plan, and it obviously has to start at that level. I don't think there's not any mandate that says that Birmingham has to do any of those things. Of course, it's up to us when there is a master plan, which is kind of what this is, sort of like a regional master plan for a transit corridor such as Woodward, that we would make all those enhancements. And it's tied into our multimodal plan, because in our multimodal plan, it also recognizes that Woodward is a major transit corridor and suggests improvements that are very much consistent with some of these recommendations that are in here. Albeit this is more up to date because the multimodal plan was done in 2013, I think. So there's more things that have come into play now that weren't necessarily considered to the same extent back then. So, but I do think it is up to us as a board to move these things forward as these plans get adopted regionally.
Yeah, this is Brad Streeter. So I was involved in the MOD project for the RTA. Jana actually came to a number of the workshops and meetings. So we had representatives of the city. So Jana and others on city staff came to the meetings with the other cities to kind of brainstorm what would be good to have consistency along Woodward for the communities in terms of transit and mobility. A lot of discussion was about improving crossings along Woodward, as we've talked about here as a board. And so MDOT was part of these discussions. The RTA's role in doing this was to get communities thinking about how development can support transit and to gradually continue to improve transit along Woodward. And then what are some mobility things that can be done? And also this whole idea of microtransit is sort of a new form of transit where there's not going to be fixed route transit, and to start looking at connections to Woodward that could be made up and down the corridor. And Oakland County has a new, like a transit guru that they've hired. Because of COVID, he's not really been advancing the transit discussion, but I talked to him a couple weeks ago, and he was also involved in these Woodward mobility-oriented development and design discussions. And so Oakland County and the RTA and SMART and the cities, I think, are going to, along Woodward, continue to work together to improve transit, sort of like ADA upgrades. So gradually doing things to improve transit in terms of shelters and stops and other things. And the RTA's goal was to have the communities working together and put some vision or suggestions out there for the communities to implement. The RTA is seeking some federal funds. I think they got some grants to start implementing some of the recommendations of the MOD study as well. So I know when we did, when we did the survey, you wanted a presentation about transit on Woodward, and we waited on that for training until this document was done. So 2021, we can give you more information or have more discussion about that if you'd like.
That would be very helpful. I'm just sort of reading through it. Sorry, Joanna. It's just, as I read through it, I fully understand anything that runs up and down the Woodward corridor being state level. But when I look at the mapping, it's got a 1 mile radius and it says Troy microtransit zone, and the Troy microtransit zone spreads from Troy half a mile inside Birmingham and is still half a mile away from Woodward. It's rather influential in what it's basically mandating should be happening, and it's somewhat aligned with 2040, somewhat not, and just pushing an awful lot of agendas that are not necessarily those of residents.
I guess generally speaking, Andrew, anything that is coming in or related to Birmingham, at least in my experience, Jana and Commander, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or engineering staff, the multimodal board gets a chance to see. It may be a past event, as Jana was mentioning, that we saw this, we could have seen this a year ago, year and a half ago. But I would say, generally speaking, that the staff bring forward at least at an awareness level. We may provide some feedback. There's different levels, I think, that would go along. We may actually be very involved. We may have a breakout board that, does support a specific endeavor, but I've not experienced personally in my almost tenure here that for instance, Big Woodward or the state road is excluded from our awareness. That is not the case generally. Doesn't mean we always have a good plan. That's different. There's one part awareness and one part involvement in, like, to your point, using the Troy example, expanding the district. But I don't know if that helped. Any other, you said, I think, Andrew, you said you had a couple. Did we hit everything that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, the couple were basically 2040 linking to this, because it seems a bit backdoor. That's all.
Are there any other items for a quick review of the team before we get to the end of the meeting here? Okay, any miscellaneous announcements, Jana?
No, none at this time.
Okay, we will end the board meeting at 7:02. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.